So the next session is going to be Amrit. He's going to be talking to his distinguished panel of guys about how different database architectures actually fit into the Trove and can be best supported. So, extending on some of the discussions from Nick and Nikhil and Doug from this morning. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amrit, and I'll let him introduce the rest of the panel.
OK, thanks, Ken. I guess everybody can hear me. I can hear myself. Good morning. I guess we're what's standing between all of you and lunch. So we're going to make sure we don't outstay that welcome. So I'm going to get started here. We're going to be talking about databases as a service, databases in the cloud. And we've got a bunch of people who know a heck of a lot about databases. So I'm going to shut up and let them do the talking. But I'll do that after I introduce you to them. Very happy to have with us today Ronan Kaufman, who is Director of Product Management at Oracle. He's responsible for virtualization and the database product. And OpenStack. Kelly Sturman, next to him, who is Director of Products at MongoDB. And Tyler Hannon, who's Director of Marketing at Basho. And Roger Levy, who's VP of Product at SkySQL. So without further ado, I'm going to pick up on maybe a question which Susan asked this morning and start kind of there. Which goes to the question of where's the data plane in database as a service? And so all of you have been in a variety of different of your customers who have all asked about database as a service. Let's kind of start by saying, in your mind, what is database as a service? And go from there. No particular order. Go for it. Ronan, go ahead.
Yeah, so when we talk about database as a service, we're basically talking about, I think, two parts. We all know the Amazon way of looking at database as a service. You come somewhere, you ask for a particular database of certain size or certain characteristics, and you get you get a connection string. You're good to go. The problem that a lot of people kind of ignore when we talk about that is that when you do it on-premise, you have to take care of the other side as well, which is, the resource consumption, make sure everything is available, make sure everything is up and running. And so when we talk about what database as a service, I think everybody kind of have an idea in mind. But I think the private database as a service, the on-premise database as a service, which Trove is trying to address in many ways, has more characteristics that we need to take care of than the what we were used to treat the database as a service when we were only users. And that is a lot of things to deal with. And so that's some of the things we need to talk about.
One perspective from, again, Oracle has, I think, more than one database. But you have SQL and NoSQL databases. But do you think that the perception is different depending on what kind of database you are? What are customers kind of looking for in that area?
Yeah, the perception is absolutely different. I think the sophistication of the database is something to not be taken lightly. When you talk about enterprise class, big databases, then you have a lot of systems that's supporting it, whether how you do backup, how you do high availability. Those are no simple things that you could just spin up a VM, press a button, and they're just fully configured. Mm-hmm. It's much more involved than that usually. And on the smaller database, on the simpler database, it's much easier. Mm-hmm. And so we can't treat all database as like it's a simple, provisioning a database is just launching a VM.
Well, let's maybe try and focus on what would people call a database as a service. Tyler, what's your view?
So it's interesting. I would say over the last 18 months, I've had more conversations about databases as a service than I've ever had before. And it reminds me a little bit of to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That databases as a service has become a nail-shaped problem. And so I ask people, what do you mean? Because it's really common for some folk, depending on what their application workload is, to look at databases as a service from the lens of multi-tenancy. And other folk who are very interested in test dev environments to look at, I need simple provisioning sort of as my minimum viable entry so that I can tear up and spin down and rip and replace. And so it's really, to me, similar to what I would say the storage industry has gone through, that people don't buy storage because storage is interesting. They buy storage because they have a problem set they're trying to solve. People don't buy databases anymore, much as I would love them to, because I'm a database nerd, because databases are interesting. They're buying them because they have an application use case. And so really, DBaaS holistically depends on the lens of the application use case. So I think from the perspective of Trove, as we heard, starting with how do we provision? And then what comes next? How do we back up? And backup and restore looks very different for something like Riak than it would for something like MySQL. And so really becomes what applications are good fits for present capability, and what is the community in the market saying they need, so that we can supplement that capability in the future.
So that's a great. What are you hearing people in the market saying? What are they looking for? So are they looking for the ability to quickly provision a database? Or are they looking for the ability to say, this is like my email. I just have a connection endpoint and I can query the damn thing?
So the answer is yes. I mean, I think that the marketplace is not any one homogeneous thing. Having had the opportunity to be with Trove since the days when it was still Red Dwarf, one of our old favorite names, what we really see is there are a number of different needs, a number of different intents. But obviously, database as a service provides a level of abstraction, making it easier for people to be able to deploy, provision, take down, scale, et cetera, their database infrastructure. And we see at least a couple of different scenarios, and I think that we started to discuss them. One is the service provider who's looking to really be able to provide a monetizable service. Can they package something so that they can then offer it on top of an infrastructure, on top of whether it's OpenStack or another infrastructure, and monetize. The more interesting case is really what we see in the enterprise. Over the last year or two, I had the advantage of being able to brief about 250, Fortune 1000 companies on cloud, and saw an amazing sort of transition part way in. For the first several months, everyone was interested in economics and savings. And then somehow, and I'm not sure what the catalyst was, it abruptly changed. And that was, tell me how we get things out faster. Time to market, time to revenue, time to deploy. And that's really what we're seeing a lot of interest with Trove and other as a service. It's how can we speed up from the time I'm ready to go? I need a new app. I want to implement a new capability. How fast can I be out there? And they look at these things as giving them the levers, giving them the self-service, so that they can speed it up without having to go through writing orders to different IT organizations and getting it done. And so it is yes, there's multiple rationale.
So let's look at maybe, so Mongo is the 5th most used, I don't know how many people knew this, Mongo is the 5th most popularly used database in the world today. 10 years ago, I don't know that Mongo existed.
That's right.
I don't know how many years ago it is, which is why I said that. It's rapidly come to the point where it's the 5th most used database. Something must be driving it. What are those kinds of things? Because, again, if I look at this panel, there's people representing two kinds of databases. One kind of database existed before I was born. The other kind, oh yeah, I'm pretty young, Don't hold it against me. The other kind of database hasn't been around. The other kind of database, less than 7 years. Something must be dramatically different about these two in terms of just what kind of environment they're going to run it. Traditional databases wanted big iron hardware. Maybe not everybody is going to get that in the cloud. So how are you seeing that from Mongo's perspective? What are people asking for when they ask you for database as a service?
Yeah, I think as my fellow panelists have pointed out, it's a diverse market. That we have a number of partners who are running database as a service businesses around MongoDB. Because MongoDB is itself, it's not a commodity, right? It's not just another relational database, it's a different kind of database. So there are multiple companies who have built businesses around operating a database as a service. Some of them are entirely software driven. Some of them are a hybrid of people and software, providing a fully managed service to their customers. I would say from our perspective, our customers, just to give a couple of interesting tidbits I've observed over the past couple of years, big companies want the benefits of a cloud service, but they're not going to put their data in the cloud necessarily just yet. So when they're thinking of database as a service, they're thinking of building a core competency within their business that operates as a service to many internal customers. And so even those concepts of billing and charging and limiting capacity that you think of as being specific to a commercial business, it's still something that these companies want internally because they're measuring the usage of different departments and cross-billing accordingly. So even those features that you might not think are appropriate behind somebody's firewall still seem to be important. The other interesting thing I would note is that I think one of the aspects that made MongoDB so popular was that it was very easy to spin up in the cloud and it ran as a distributed system by default. So on EC2, in a couple of minutes, you could be up and running with a highly available database. But the nature of hardware in the enterprise is still predominantly big iron. And because VMware and Oracle have taught companies to buy these big servers, they don't necessarily have hardware that's really aligned with NoSQL databases or other types of software, unless you're going to slice it up with virtualization. So it's not uncommon for us to have a sort of unusual conversation with the customers, like, you are actually vastly over-provisioned for the sort of availability goals you're trying to reach. Here are some different ways you could think about cutting up your infrastructure to take advantage of the flexibility of these other technologies.
So I guess you mentioned Amazon, you mentioned big iron hardware, I mentioned it as well. And there's the new way of doing it, which is pizza box style, one-use servers. Both of them serve a very different kind of purpose. But from your experience seeing people actually deploy these solutions, and quick show of hands here, how many people in the room here are contributors to Trove? How many of you have contributed a patch or more? So you got a bunch of people here who over the next couple of days are going to be working on what are we going to do for Trove in the kilo time frame? What have you learned from your customer conversations which would help drive us in what we're planning for the next couple of days? There's the issue of big iron hardware versus one-use servers, and how do you get access to that? Ronan talked about it in the morning session. Any other learnings which you'd like to share with us?
I think the big one, and it plays, I think, very well into the overall mission and philosophy of OpenStack is scale. I mean, most of our customers, are either in the midst of scaling, hope to scale as their businesses succeed, and how they can really scale their database capability as they scale out, in general, in the cloud, I think is a critical area. We're now seeing, within Juno, replication coming in, and I think looking at other aspects of, providing HA performance in a particular scale is going to be critical to the broader database set.
Ronan?
I think, just to your comment, there are various use cases of, what database they're used for and what type of scale and capacity you need. And, some of the MongoDB is a perfect match, some is just not a match at all. And in an organization, you probably need both. And we want to grow a DBaaS platform to be able to match the very scalable databases as well as those big iron, because a lot of customers still do need highly performant database. To your question earlier about is databases like an email that you just get your mailbox and you can connect, I think databases cannot work in that mode because in many applications, the performance and other characteristics of availability and backup are very, very critical. And in email, you get your email, 1 second later, it doesn't matter. But there are certain applications that, where you run a call center or you run a highly, a huge HR system that, if they go below a certain performance threshold, they just don't work. And so I do think that there is a range of use cases, and Oracle still has a lot of customers that are using very, very large database that you just cannot spin up in the way that you describe. You just can't. And there are ways this is improving, but the nature of the problem is that it's big, it has to be highly available, and it has to perform. And so I think the solution should kind of encompass a range of use cases, and I think we're just...
So in other words, you're saying Trove should not be one size fits all. It should be...
Well, we want the experience probably to be one size fits all, but we have very good understanding that the backends could be a VM you spin up, or maybe an Exadata machine that stands in your data center, and you can just overlay Trove on it, and using Trove, go in it and provision private database and hand that to the user. So those are the kind of things that you have to keep in mind. The fact that the database is really scalable and provisions in minutes doesn't mean it fits every use cases.
So looking at this from an entirely different perspective, Tyler, you started talking about people don't buy storage because they want storage. They buy it because they got a real problem. Basho is a little bit different from the other three companies here.
Yes,
in the regard that from a standards perspective, you've got a product which is S3 compliant. So effectively you're saying, we're just block storage, we're not a database. So how does that fit into the database as a service thing? Do you see a value of a database as a service as opposed to storage? What do you, your perspective?
That's an interesting story. We have two products. We have Riak, which is the database, right? High availability, very sort of Dynamo, paper-inspired approach to scale of adding nodes, similar to Cassandra in that approach, different from other approaches. And then as we began to enter frankly, the OpenStack ecosystem, as well as a couple of others, customers said to us, hey, that's really cool that you have high availability, but we'd like an interoperability layer that would make it look and feel more like storage, more like objects. And so what we did is we built S3 and Swift and user management compatibility layers on top of the database. So Riak CS, the object storage product, is really just Riak with stuff on top of it. And that was because our customers, our community, sort of drew us in that direction. And I think that we'll see some of that with Trove, that as people begin to do different deployments, we'll see directional sort of ideas that can be, mapped to use cases. And, as Ronan said, the term that we use a lot is polyglot deployment. I have data that looks Oracle-shaped and relational. Rad, I'm going to shove it into an Oracle database. I have data that's sort of very key value style and critical, and I want to, it's maybe immutable, so I don't really care about updates. I just want to shove it somewhere and be able to get it when I need it. And Riak's a great fit for that. Or I may have some really interesting documents that I want to put into a sharded replica set on super fast storage so that I can pull it out into my application, and that's what Mongo's great for. And so, when I first started working as a DBA, everything was DB2 on AIX shaped. The beauty of what we do now is that I'm able to store data in different ways based on the way that the data should be stored. And so, as I said, for us, that was people saying, hey, we really want to store data as objects. And we're like, cool, we'll do this thing called Riak CS. And then people are like, we still use a lot of key value. And we said, cool, we'll keep Riak and hang out with the Trove community and see how we can plug in better there so that we can provide a broader range of solution rather than just the tight object integration.
No, okay. By the way, if you guys have questions, put them up on #Trove Day. We'll see them there. I don't know if I can see them down here or not, but somebody can tell me if there's a question.
So the question of what should Trove be doing to interoperate with these systems, I think there's a consistent story here that the way these systems operate and scale is quite different. And if you look at especially the distributed systems, the way capacity planning is handled, the way provisioning is handled, the way failover and scale out they're all different. There's no standard for this. But they're just a piece of a larger puzzle between virtualization, operating system, and other aspects of the stack. And I think, so my point to you would be, there are two key things in my mind that are really critical. One is the API, the API definitions, so that the handoffs can be fluid and not become counterproductive. And the second thing is around monitoring, that you don't want some layer of the stack to be a black box you have no insight into. There need to be clearly defined ways to access the monitoring data, and especially in these distributed systems, when something goes wrong, you shouldn't have to SSH into 50 different instances and collect all these and hope that they all have the same sense of time and try and splice your logs together. There needs to be tooling and infrastructure to make the issue resolution part of operations much, much easier. I think when you're operating on just a single server, that's a relatively straightforward situation. When you're operating in a distributed system, which is sort of par for the course in most technology now, things get to be much more complicated. And that needs to be part of the strategy for the whole stack.
So I guess we're going to hear some of where Trove's been thinking about this in Austin's presentation. And we heard some about it in replication. And when we met in Austin, I think 6 months ago, we tried to come up with a kind of an abstraction which would represent different data stores, and each one having a slightly different way of wanting to do things, adding replicas, removing replicas, and how we've implemented the API for clustering. So maybe we should talk something more about that later, or we'll hear about it in their presentations. But from your perspective, what are the things which you've learned from people who are using Mongo in the cloud predominantly, or all of you using, say, Oracle in the cloud, or SkySQL in the cloud? How have you changed your products to adapt to that? What are some of those customizations which you've implemented in your product, which maybe are good learnings for us, good learnings for people who are trying to deploy these things in their own environments?
I'll just give a couple of brief points. So by far, the vast majority of use of MongoDB is in the cloud. I don't know exactly how much money Amazon makes on Mongo, but it's probably more than we do. Our best estimate right now is there are about 250,000 deployments of Mongo. And as I said, the vast majority are in the cloud, especially on EC2. And I think one of the things we learned early on was if you didn't give people the right guidance, it was pretty easy for them to have a bad experience in the cloud. That in those early days, the cheapest option in the cloud was a 32-bit OS with just a paltry amount of RAM. And we made some choices early on in the design of Mongo that we weren't really engineering for 32-bit systems. We were engineering for 64-bit systems. And so if your database was larger than 2 gigabytes, you were in trouble. And so people would, Mongo is very easy to use. Most people don't really read the manual. They just get started and charge forward on a micro instance in 32-bit OS and only 1 gig of RAM, and then guess what? They have a terrible experience, and then suddenly they're on blogs and Twitter talking about how terrible the product is. So I think for any software provider today, you need to really think about if it's available in the cloud, how do you ensure a high quality experience of the product in the cloud when you don't really control what the hardware is that people are going to use? So we've changed the product over the years to be more accommodating to those sorts of environments, and we've worked closely with Amazon and Rackspace and Microsoft and others to help make sure that there's some minimum set of capabilities in these environments so that people have a reasonable experience with the product.
But just sort of following on to that, I think, two lessons learned. And the first one really dovetails, and that's the cloud's not magic. Simply because someone's deploying a database in the cloud doesn't make all their problems go away and everything easier. So the intrinsic features in the work that we do on the database, whether it's improving performance or adding parallel slave replication, or interoperability features are still, really critical. But what does matter is helping with different deployment models. And Trove is one of them. There are many others in the cloud space, whether it be Docker containers or helping people be able to make sure they've got the right Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt. You add your favorite in there. Ways of deploying into their favorite cloud property. We're seeing sort of this Cambrian explosion of different ways that customers are going to consume databases. And we really need to make sure that as the supporters and as the vendors that we make sure that they can in fact consume it across all of those different vectors.
I would say we fall somewhere in between the two, in that there's nothing worse as a database vendor than to get the email that's like, your database sucks. And you say, why does my database suck? And they're like, because it's Thursday and US 1 East turned off. And you're like, great.
Because it's the database I'm using.
Right.
That's why it's
Because, the experience of database usage, be it on traditional big iron monolithic infrastructure, be it on cloud deployment on commodity infrastructure that sits alongside my orchestration framework, be it tightly coupled to whatever I've chosen as my orchestration tool, be it fully cloud orchestration or automation framework, Ansible, Chef, Puppet choices, the experience matters. We have spent more time investing in deployments and ease of deployment and sane defaults and things like in a distributed system, explaining how vector clocks work and why last write wins may not be fun, and never trust clock time because clocks are jerks, and things like that seem non-core to the product, but they're core to the usage.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the shift in thinking, is that it's not about the database. I'm a database vendor, I can't believe I just said that. It's not about the database, it's about the application, and it's about the application use case experience. And that question that came up earlier about SLAs, I think, ties cleanly to what Ronan was saying as well, which is I'm going to be deploying different things in different ways, and the more that I can templatize the way those deployments work, and hey, this is this kind of shaped problem, you may want to do this kind of thing, and this is another shaped problem, you probably want to do it another way, makes the experience for the OpenStack admin or the company that has invested in OpenStack as their orchestration framework that much better. And makes people yell at me less.
So that's interesting. So you're pointing to limitations, if you will, in the framework or in the environment in which you're operating.
The problem with the framework is that I want it to fit my use case. But my use case and Kelly's use case and Ronan's use case and Chris Merz's use case and everyone's use case is different. So a framework is about enablement, right? Why do people adopt frameworks? It's about orchestration and automation, and people talk about agility and time to market and speed, and all those are great things, but all those are very different problems depending on the company. And so it really, to me, boils down to what can we provide that's useful, that's understandable, that's use case based, Riak use case being very different from an Oracle use case, explain that cleanly, and then see what the community and the users say is next.
Okay, in that case,
let me that way.
Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
So I think it relates back to what I said in the very, very beginning, which is the commonality is in how we consume the database. The huge difference is how we provision and configure it. And so every framework that is wanting to be a generic database as a service or other as a service needs to, take that into account. There needs to be a back end which you could write and could be completely different than mine, and there needs to be a front end which has to be similar between you and me. And so, the way Oracle has been addressing this for several years now is trying to templatize a lot of the applications and databases. So if you go to edeliver.oracle.com and you look, there are a lot of templates you could download and deploy and it's relatively easy, right, in that case. But we've taken it to the next level with databases where we created a full Riak template. Riak is known to be a quite sophisticated deployment. You need a lot of experience usually. And we try to lower the bar, recognizing exactly what was said here, that the defaults matter. The way you configure it really matters for your experience, for people not to say this just does not work. So I think going forward, we got to recognize that as a base, as a starting point. Implementation, deployment, backend, completely different, front end, unified. And this also has other implications. For example, if you look at Neutron, Neutron gave a ton of opportunities for companies to come in and monetize. You know, they could create load balancer as a service, VPN as a service, firewall as a service, L2, L3, DNS, what have you. And this, Neutron has its challenges, right? But, but I think conceptually, that's how you solve this problem of different, distinct databases where you want a unified experience. So that's kind of what Oracle has done. Also, a lot of things in the database, like private database and multi-tenancy and all those things. So, but I think the point is that there will always be some things we do in our application, and I don't want necessarily the user to know about the consumer, the end consumer, not the DBA, to know about those things. I just want it to be easy and reliable and repeatable. So that's kind of where we see things.
So Oracle's already spent a lot of time and resources in this with Oracle VM, with Oracle templates. You want to talk quickly about some of the things which you can do with the templates, which are going to be interesting to people in the sense, for example, what would you do if you had dedicated hardware, and how does templates interface? I don't know. Does everybody know what templates in Oracle are, or? Okay,
so I only spend like 30, 40 seconds about what those are. Those are, the different application groups have created templates that could run on the Oracle virtualization platform, Oracle VM. And usually you download, it's a virtual machine, you start it up. When it starts, you put your parameters in, and it's up and running. For some things, it's production ready. For others, like, I don't know, e-business suites and the other things which you really need your organizational data, it could be as a reference architecture. So those are the templates, and Oracle's invested in that quite heavily. Now, I'm responsible for OpenStack at Oracle, and my previous title was Oracle VM, so I know them both. And one of the goals that I want to make sure we do is we transfer all this wealth of investment and knowledge onto OpenStack, that we can take those templates, these Riak templates, the database, and use them on top of OpenStack, and actually reuse that effort. And since that investment has already been done, and we want to leverage that, we want to see how we connect that with the different OpenStack services that are available, and Trove in particular. So that's kind of what we've done and where we're going with this.
So in terms of other people who've already invested a lot in this area, SkySQL is also doing a bunch of things that I've heard about. Do you want to take a second and tell us what those are, Roger? Especially for in the cloud, things which are going to be relevant to Trove.
Overall, it may just be good to take a step back. SkySQL is the company essentially behind the enterprise version of MariaDB, which is really the evolution of MySQL by pretty much the same core team that created MySQL. Our goal really is to make MariaDB the cloud consumable database for real scalability, asset level transactions, and doing so by working across all of the different aspects of cloud. Trove being an exceptionally important one, partnering with Tesora to make sure that MariaDB is tested and well certified with all of the major OpenStack implementations, working with Red Hat. We're very pleased to see Rackspace now rolling out MariaDB within their public cloud implementation, coming soon on Pivotal Cloud Foundry. So our goal really is to make it very easy, depending upon the use case, depending upon what approach to cloud a service provider or an enterprise wishes to take to really be able to use and consume MariaDB going forward. And for us, I think we're seeing great adoption within Red Hat RHEL 7. We're now the default database. In SUSE 12, we're becoming the default database. And for us, we're an application level compatible plug-in to MySQL and bringing forward all the next set of capabilities. And I think one of the things we really didn't talk about in the Trove context, and that's also just the importance of things such as interoperability among databases and different data technologies. And that's another area of focus for us, and bringing things like a Cassandra gateway out to the marketplace that allows you to link between MariaDB as a relational database and Cassandra, and we'll be looking at other various capabilities like this in the future.
Interesting. I see Katie has a mic in her hand. If people have questions, if you haven't tweeted them already, which I can't see. In DBaaS, context is everything. What does service mean to the implementing organization?
It's something we've all mentioned, and I think it's worth reiterating. As a service, what does service mean? That totally depends on who you are, right? And I think that from the perspective of Trove, what's very interesting to me is Trove to me is unique among other projects inside of the OpenStack ecosystem in that I'm going to use a Colorado analogy, so bear with me on this one. You're out over your skis. There are other projects where you go and you build something, and then the community's like, what did you just do? That doesn't make any sense. We're, in an interesting sort of way, able to say, here's what we're building that makes sense, that proves capabilities. Here's how we're going to implement scheduling so that there's not single points of failure. Here's how we're going to make Trove functional, and there's community feedback at the same time. And that's disconcerting because you get this sort of internal feeling of behind, but it's really important because it lends towards directionality. So for those of you who are writing code, you're in a great place, even though it may not feel like it at 2 o'clock in the morning some days.
Some of us are a little bit later than that, like that guy. We picked on him already. Others? I got more if nobody else wants to. Okay. So you've all been definitely talking to your customers who've been asking you about OpenStack and what can we get on OpenStack, and you have products on there. Do you see any trends in terms of which industries that's in? Do you see any changes in the way in which people are doing things in the rest of their operations around the cloud, around your databases?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's all I've been doing in the last year and a half, hearing about customers and what they want to do with OpenStack in general. I think, there are different types of levels of understanding. There's one that, hey, I got this OpenStack thing. Well, what do you do with that? What can it buy me? Okay, give me 2 of those. And they are the most sophisticated users, and you see them in telcos primarily. I mean, those are the big ones. You see guys like eBay and other, people with very, very strong IT skill set and, financials. But slowly but surely, we started seeing them all over the place. So the ones that were asking questions about, hey, what this OpenStack thing is, a year back now, they're starting a POC. And so you definitely see the trend. I don't think they do it necessarily for database as a service, but database as a service is kind of, okay, once we get everything else going, what about the database? It has to be there. So it's an essential piece of the transition to the cloud rather than, the purpose itself. And we see that as trailing the general trend of moving to OpenStack among those more advanced users. Now we see it coming from another direction. People who are heavy database users and looking for a DBaaS solution, and like everybody else, Oracle also has its own database as a service solution, and they're looking for something which is different, which is integratable with the other trend that is coming along. So we see that coming from that angle. Okay, I need a database as a service. What should I use? And you look around, and OpenStack is there. So those are the two trends that I think are leading to people to look more into databases as a service at this time.
But in terms of within OpenStack, within the adoption verticals you mentioned specifically were telcos again?
Well, the interesting thing is that it started, with those telcos and very advanced users, but now it's really everybody. I mean, I can't think of a call that I had lately about virtualization and cloud that OpenStack didn't come up, and maybe because I own OpenStack, maybe it's kind of related, but and I get pulled into this calls, but kind of self-selection there. But people that I used to talk to about other things, they're being interested or built their own stuff with their own front ends. It's definitely looking as the way they're going to go for the private cloud.
So Kelly, yeah, go ahead.
I would just add to we talk about the Bay Area bubble, and I don't mean real estate. I mean this weird phenomena that even old companies act like startups in the Bay Area. So there's that contingency, companies within a 50-mile radius of SFO, and then there is everybody else. And what we see are in companies 100 years old and older, there are these rogue contingencies that go and find a project, and they build a case for this new way of doing things that has to do with cloud and rapid software development and a flexible data model and just the new way of doing things. And based on an initial success with that project, they go and try and fight through the bureaucracy of their company to get it approved and become a standard that you can use in lots of different projects. And that cycle is like a 3-year cycle, right? It's not something that happens quickly the way it happens with a startup or somebody in the Bay Area bubble. So I would say, based on my experience with these two contingencies, that it's EC2. It's surprisingly, for some of these large companies, it's Azure. But for on-prem, it's vCenter and OpenStack. And so when we look at, just take a second, what is MongoDB? Well, the company sponsors the project, and we sell support and services and stuff like that. But one of the big things that we've been working on for the past couple of years is a management platform for MongoDB to make it so you can provision and upgrade, add capacity, do all of these things with the click of a button with zero downtime to your apps, right? And that's something we will launch in the next 6 weeks. And anyone will be able to take advantage of that first on EC2, and then we'll sell it for people to use on-prem. So when we look at what are we going to integrate this, which platforms are we going to integrate with underneath for virtualization, for vCenter and OpenStack, those are the two. And then on top, for orchestration frameworks, what are we going to integrate with? But that because MongoDB is so popular, we sort of have a pretty big set of data points on this, but it's very strongly reflecting OpenStack and vCenter and then EC2 for public cloud.
Yeah, I'd agree with that in terms of the general choice of cloud services that people use. I just add that I'm always surprised by the use cases that pop up that you would never think about. Utility companies who are collecting streaming meter data, who you walk into expecting a very sort of traditional IT infrastructure because they're part of local government, and they're like, oh yeah, that's the way that side of the business works. Those of us who are actually dealing with data, we have this OpenStack deployment that we've had up and running for 2 years, and here's how we're doing automation, here's how we're... And it's interesting to me how 18 months ago, I would have conversations where people were like, we've got this sort of cloud side project, be it somebody gone rogue and spun up things on AWS, or we're testing OpenStack, or we're playing with Cloud Platform, and many of those in the 3-year cycle that Kelly talks about are more than halfway into it and are successful. And so it's become a conversation topic rather than a oh, and by the way, we're going to try to do this on. It's been, how do you work with? And that's a fairly major shift as a database provider to change from, oh, and it's going to be running on this over here, to tell me how you interoperate with my cloud platform, or my cloud orchestration platform, to be clear, or my automation framework. How do you interoperate with those? How do you make my life easier?
I think the other key thing we're seeing in a real key shift, I agree with the other panelists. A lot of this started out, call them rogue, call them bleeding edge, projects. Depends upon which side of the fence you're on, I guess. But what we're now seeing, and I saw this in the past, and seeing it even more just over the last few months, is cloud, and in particular OpenStack, is now really making its way up to the CIO agenda. A lot more interest, a lot more inquiries, a lot more discussion. And that is really taking this to more of a strategic level than a business unit project level, which I think is one of those critical turning points in the introduction of a new technology into the industry. And just some of the examples of companies that I see considering OpenStack. I mean, these are not the first movers. Manufacturers, auto companies, banking. These are not folks that are usually head of the line for a new technology. It's usually let those other guys try it first, and then when they've suffered the the pains, we'll look at it. But this is quite different, and I think part of it is the overall promise of cloud, which hopefully we'll all deliver on. And then really how well OpenStack has created, and then we talked about this before in some of the opening talks, the ecosystem around OpenStack. With thousands and thousands and thousands of members to OpenStack, thousands of people from different companies contributing to OpenStack, the numbers of companies that are involved, and they all touch the different industries. They all touch their customers. They all touch their partners, and I think that's really beginning to have a tremendous network effect for adoption of cloud and ultimately the adoption of OpenStack.
Yeah, to your point about 100-year-old companies which are using OpenStack, we're working with one which I think is probably, more than 100 years old. And one of the things we demonstrated to them, they've got, I don't know, technical term, metric shitloads of data which is stored somewhere on Swift. And they can't cost-effectively analyze that data on any of their existing databases. So we spun up for them a OpenStack-based set of machines with another product which we make, which is called DV, which is horizontal scale for a database. The use case for them is very simply this, and it didn't occur to me, though a lot of people I've seen, and many of you are probably in this room, you go to your IT department and you ask for a database, and sometimes the answer you get is, it'll be ready in a couple of months. What we delivered to these folks is the ability for an analyst to hit a button, choose a bunch of data from said metric shitload of data, provision a bunch of database instances with Trove. 7 minutes later, the databases are up and running. Half a day later, the data is loaded. They can run their queries against it, standard MySQL. And the thing which I was really kicked about is the whole thing worked end to end. The thing they were kicked about was something slightly different. When we're done with this, we can tear the damn thing down and we can create a new one, because the way in which we think is iterative. It's not like I know the question I want to ask, and I ask it and I get the answer. But I ask a question and that leads to only one thing, the next question. In my old way of doing things, it took me 3 months to get the answer, so I'd better make sure I got the right question. Here I can ask a question and ask another one the next day. And that's something which we see Trove as being a very valuable part of. So we're really happy to be in this space. So before I get booted off the stage, before we all get booted off the stage, any other questions? Ken?
I know we've got some other friends in the audience who may have other perspectives on databases. Like, Joe, I see you out here is from HP Vertica. These guys have very radically different architectures. Vertica is yet another radically different architecture. Are there things you see in, in the space of database as a service that, and in the cloud that impacts, that style of data management?
I think given Vertica's, the kind of use cases we typically handle, scale becomes a very significant factor, which impacts your ability not just to run it in the cloud within the different cloud environments, but then also being able to load data, right? It takes a very long time to do that. So, it's something that we're still exploring at this point still, but it's also, I guess maybe a facet that we may have to deal with more than some other databases.
Yep.
Get to the point about loading data. The same customer, which I was talking about, has a use case where they said, we need to load data. Not letting out too much, it's a company which loads CDR data. And their goal was we need to load 100,000 rows a second of CDR data. And okay, so we set the goal within the company, we need to do 1 million. 15 Amazon EC2 instances, virtualized, completely virtualized MySQL instances with DVE, 1 million rows a second. A lot of people tell me you can't do that with a relational database, have to use NoSQL. Choose the database which is right for your application. With virtualization, you can probably do it, and with Trove, you certainly can. So.
I think, at the risk of saying the same thing in a slightly different way, it's interesting with 4 database vendors on the stage, we're not arguing about transactional semantics. Or
we could if you'd like.
I mean, I'm happy to, and
more than welcome to.
We could talk distributed consensus algorithms until the cows come home, right?
Sort of throw acid
all
at
4 of
each
us
other,
are saying ease of use, right? And understand the customer use case and use the right tool for that job. And that's a fairly radical shift in the thinking behind database implementation. And that's what I'm excited about seeing with Trove as it matures is I've got great options and I've got a wide palette of databases to choose from based on what I'm doing. So I'm going to choose the one that fits the data that I have.
It doesn't have to be one.
Yeah.
You could have multiple.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, Susan has a question.
Any thoughts from the panel on Trove interfaces outside the context of OpenStack? So just the API on other environments? Any other environment, or database supporting the REST API itself?
I'll let you guys and anybody else, Nikhil, if you want to chime in as well.
It's a great question.
Yep.
It's definitely something that, at least from the OpenStack Trove perspective, I really haven't given much thought to as yet. But it's an interesting spin on things, and I think Trove as a project is quite entrenched into the OpenStack way of doing things, and so I'm not entirely sure or entirely convinced what parts of Trove can be pulled out and extracted, and whether extracting those parts and then having something as an MVP just based on those parts will be of much use. So that's something that's certainly an exercise that's worth doing and looking at in the future, but I don't think, at least from a Trove perspective, it's not something that I've looked at.
I think Susan's question probably relates to a patch which we're all reviewing about Stevedore, maybe. There's a patch right now under consideration for abstracting some of the endpoints from Trove out and making them available through Stevedore, right?
You can imagine Swift running in the OpenStack and Swift then becoming a service in Cloud Foundry. And I think some of us see there's really good opportunity that Trove is also one of those things that if it was, maybe Trove and Horizon, for example, could not only run in OpenStack, but they're also as a service, and if you're familiar with Cloud Foundry, it could run there as well. I think that's really what we were thinking.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is you heard all 4 of us talk about other orchestration frameworks that our customers know and love and trust and use. And as somebody who sells databases, I'm keenly interested in them using them on the platform they love, right? And so if that's via a common method of doing as a service templated deployment, cool, because that's fewer things I need to integrate to. If it's not, I'm still going to integrate to other things as well.
Excellent to hear from your perspective and from yours at IBM. But the idea is Trove is going to be database as a service, and right now the intention is the southbound interface is still an OpenStack thing. And maybe there's a value in doing something else as well. So, good learning. Ken, I think it's all yours. Thank you very much.